of BDI, the Brazilian Agency for Development and Innovation, especially focusing Latin America and Africa. Reginaldo Arcuri also talked about a cooperation dialogue with some of Brazil's traditional partners, including the United States, which one of these initiatives, it was the Innovation Summit we had just 2 days ago here in Washington. Okay? From a private sector perspective, we had a director of international operations of Braskem, one of the leading Brazilian chemical companies, describing first the operations of a leading Brazilian multinational abroad, a very interesting presentation on how they are structured, and this is really a new challenge for Brazilian companies. He talked about the motivations, the benefits, and the challenges of internationalization for Brazil, and for a group like Braskem, okay? And the importance of governance support, both in Brazil and overseas for these operations. So this was quite interesting as well to see how the internationalization of a Brazilian company will demand, or it's already demanding, a different approach to international issues by the Brazilian government. Not only Brazil has to give support domestically to these international operations, but also internationally it will eventually have to change the scope of some policies that are pursued abroad. Okay. There were also some interesting discussions, some more independent discussions about the policy-making process for economic diplomacy and the positions, the Brazilian positions at international forums and international economic forums. Okay. One analysis, a very interesting analysis, was made by Pedro da Mota Veiga, who mentioned that in spite of the new condition of Brazil's international presence, something we've been discussing, we started discussing this morning and we're going to continue discussing in the other panel, there has only been very slight changes in Brazil's economic diplomacy per se. If you look at the positions that Brazil adopts at international forums, okay, commodities continue to be a priority for export promotion strategies. When you look at Brazil's position at the World Trade Organization, it's still very much based on commodities. Brazil continues to have a defensive position on these so-called new topics at international forums, and that I mean trade in services, investment, intellectual property, and these kind of issues. And priority to alliances with countries from the South continue. So we still see political interests ahead of pragmatism in most of Brazilian positions. We do see some changes, and this was something that Pedro described during his presentation in Brazil. If you look at the Brazilian position for climate change at the Copenhagen summit we had last year, there was a very a change in alliances that Brazil has been pursuing traditionally. Also at the G20, some of the latest movements by Brazil. Brazil has been an ally to the United States, defending some positions here on economic growth. And also at the Doha round. At the Doha round, we had Brazil not leaving behind, but shifting a traditional approach towards a South, to defending interests from the South, to aligning more pragmatically with the United States and European countries to actually close a deal at the Doha round. That was the last movements we had from Brazil at this point. Okay, so this was some of the points that were discussed in Brasilia, and I would like, just before we actually get started with the discussions here, to bring a few considerations here. Okay, so what is changing when we talk about this new profile of Brazil's international projection? What are the causes? What is causing this new profile? Why is Brazil why all of a sudden the world has realized that Brazil is in a new position, is in a different position than it has traditionally had? Okay? Well, most very basic aspect behind this is the political and economic stability that Brazil has had for the past 20 years, I would say. Okay, for the past, when you look at political stability, the level, we were just talking here this morning about political stability in the transition process. Also, economic stability in the last 16 years, this has played a very important role and has given Brazil the opportunity to pursue different agendas in terms of economic development, in terms of international relations. Okay. The recent, in spite of this economic stability that we've had in the country for the last 16 years, more recently, the economic performance of Brazil has been grabbing the attention of the international community. And that has got to do with the global demand for commodities, especially food, the growing purchasing power of the so-called new middle class in Brazil, several people moving from poverty to middle class. This is really, Brazil is really becoming a very important, a very interesting place to do business. All these people now becoming consumers, that really attracts the attention of investors. The amounts of international reserves that Brazil has been able to accumulate in the last few years. Okay? And also the stimulus measures to deal with the economic crisis more recently. Brazil was one of the first countries to come out of the economic crisis. He handled the crisis quite well, and this really helped Brazil project the projection of Brazil's economic leadership. Okay? There are other aspects such as the internationalization of Brazilian companies. More and more we see Brazilian companies operating in places throughout South America, places like Africa, and even in the United States we have several examples of Brazilian companies operating here, including Braskem. Okay? The perspective of Brazil becoming an energy power, both in terms of biofuel and oil and gas, with deep sea exploration of oil. The consolidation of Brazil as a leading destination of FDI, and there are several reasons for that. Interest rates continue to be very high in Brazil, plus the Brazilian financial markets have reached a very good level of stability. Brazil is investment grade, is considered investment grade by the main rating agencies. Then this new middle class that I just mentioned, the investment opportunities we have in the oil and gas chain, and infrastructure opportunities for investments in infrastructure as well, especially in the sports events. Okay? And I think a very important aspect that has helped Brazil to project in a different profile is the charisma and the leadership of President Lula. Lula has played a very important role in this process. So this is something interesting to be monitored in this transition process to a new president in Brazil. Okay, it's very, very much likely that we will not have a leader with such a charisma and such a leadership to project Brazil as Lula has been doing, and Cardoso did during his presidency as well. Okay. Well, also just some points that I would like to highlight. Combined with this new profile of Brazil's international projection, a new international leadership is expected from Brazil, both from domestic and international players. So what do domestic players expect from Brazil in this new scenario? Okay, as companies internationalize, as companies operate in international markets, they expect Brazil to be more engaged in trade and investment facilitation measures, agreements with countries that facilitate, for instance, double taxation, that promote regulatory convergence, facilitate foreign trade clearance procedures, and things like that. We've still a lot of expectation from these domestic players to see Brazil moving in that direction. Okay. Also, mechanisms to protect Brazilian investments abroad, as it was mentioned here in the previous panel. Brazil pursues a soft power strategy, and sometimes this soft power strategy is perceived as too soft by some domestic players. It will be very interesting to see more active mechanisms to protect these Brazilian investments abroad. Such mechanisms, these legal binding mechanisms, would even be a way to not to involve the diplomacy in every dispute we have with other countries regarding investments. This would sort of neutralize the diplomacy from every single dispute that we have involving Brazilian investments abroad. Okay? And also a more pragmatic approach to trade policy with what I'm calling here the traditional trade partners, which are basically the countries from the north, the United States and Europe, basically. Okay? And that includes the possibility of signing bilateral trade agreements. Okay? As we know, Brazil's strategy is in the past few years has been to pursue trade agreements with partners from the South, which very often these agreements have more of a political motivation than an actual trade promotion interests. And the international players, these players that are investing in Brazil, they also expect a different leadership from Brazil in this context. Okay? They expect Brazil to have new responsibilities as a key emerging market, and that means sharing the cost of this leadership. We actually have to pay alongside with the countries that have been engaged in the G8. Brazil will actually have to pay some of these costs as well. And also a more pragmatic, pro-business approach to economic diplomacy. This is also expected from these international investors to Brazil. Okay? So just to conclude, we're very optimistic on Brazil's economic performance in the next few years. It's very hardly the possibilities of being any big changes to this. The question is how Brazil will handle the expectations of domestic and international players for this leadership and responsibilities. Okay, and some questions here. The profile of the new president is likely to impact this. Okay, whoever wins the election next week. They're definitely not going to have the international profile of Lula or Cardoso, so we're going to see some changes there. Okay. Also, we see Brazil in a transitional process. We're going through a transition in which Brazil is seeking to occupy a new place in economic diplomacy. Okay. Brazil has been talking a lot about governance of financial institutions. Though when you look at the actual approach, at the actual positions of Brazil at international forums, they continue to be pretty much the same as they were before. And there is not a clear definition on the effective leadership in South America. This is also something very loose. This is also something that sometimes, at least the domestic constituencies in Brazil have the impression that Brazil is not really playing the role it should be playing as a regional leader, which I think there's no doubts about this leadership regionally, though there are questions about Brazil's capacity to be one of the global leaders. Okay? And also a more pragmatic approach to bilateral relations with traditional partners. I think this is also something we would expect from Brazil. So this is just some ideas that I would like to introduce here, and I'll hand over to Dona Hirnek to make her presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. Joel and I talked and agreed that we would speak from the table so that we can interrupt each other more easily. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's particularly interesting for me to be asked to speak about Brazil-U.S. commercial relations, not from the point of view of someone who is involved in negotiations or concerned about what MOUs are being signed between visiting cabinet members, but from the perspective of where the delivery trucks meet the road, of how it is actually to do business in Brazil. It's not to minimize, of course, the importance that the official commercial and official political relations have in the overall dynamic between Brazil and the United States. Certainly the right kind of agreement can make it a lot easier to do business, and I think UNICA's ability and the ability of the Brazilian ethanol industry to do business has been facilitated by our agreement in that area. And certainly lack of cooperation or negative environment politically or commercially can affect your ability to do business. If you were a company who had an important input or product on the list of those targeted for retaliation in the cotton dispute, you had a real concern about how that might be negotiated out at the government-to-government level. But if you're not affected immediately and in a very concrete way by some of what's going on at the 50,000-foot level, it's amazing how companies just go along doing business and making do on a day-to-day basis. Now, that said, I think some companies, and I'm fortunate to work for one of them, are starting to look at Brazil on two different tracks, one of which I would call the traditional business track, the more narrow track, if you will. And the other is a little bit more expansive, what is Brazil's place in the world in addressing some of the global issues that we from the private sector are also engaged with. We have the review of the Millennium Development Goals in New York this week. Private sector has a very strong role there, but we're not an independent partner. We have to work with governments. What kind of a role is Brazil going to play in those kinds of issues? So let me leave that for the end. Let me talk just a little bit first about the day-to-day operations. From the perspective of a consumer products company, the nature of discussions about Brazil has changed greatly in the 6 years that I've been in the private sector. Back in 2004, those of us who were involved with Brazil all had copies of Prahlad's Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid book on our desks to show that we understood that doing business in Brazil meant reaching the bottom of the pyramid, right? Creating the kinds of products that were going to appeal to the D classes, even into E classes, but that's where the future of business lied in a country like Brazil. Now it's all about that emerging middle class that we just heard about. How do you create products? How do you market for these aspirational consumers who increasingly have economic wherewithal to meet those aspirations, if not on a consistent and certainly on a sporadic basis, and those sporadic episodes are occurring with more and more frequency. So we talk about Brazil in a different way now when we make business decisions. Because that consumer class is growing so rapidly in Brazil, it's a challenge to keep it supplied, to keep those new consumers making sure they have the products to put on the shelves. And that's actually spurring some investment in other countries around the region. Not so much to import in Brazil, but many of us have been using Brazil as an export platform to other countries. Now we need that production in Brazil to satisfy new demand. The effect is that even though other markets might not be growing as fast and certainly don't have the potential for future growth just given their size, what's happening in Brazil is causing companies to invest in Brazil's neighbors as well. Of course, we're all looking at investing in Brazil, but investing, as many of you know, is a lot harder than it needs to be, or that ideally it would be. I think the biggest issue companies face today in Brazil is the lack of skilled labor. Now, for last couple of years, any of us who have large offices, and particularly in Sao Paulo, but in the Southeast, have run up into this hunt for professional talent. And you know that people in finance or engineers, almost as soon as they come to you, have dropped their resume at some headhunter's office on the way because they'll be looking for another opportunity, not necessarily because they're unhappy, but because they know that in that market they can command a better position with better pay and better benefits. It was good to hear that international relations is the most popular course in Brazil these days. Would that it was industrial engineering, Exactly. But that's part of the territory when you've got an economy that's heating up like Brazil, that's emerging like Brazil with that strong economic industrial base. The real need is for skilled workers at the plant level. the number of years of school that someone has does not totally reflect the amount of knowledge that they've acquired in Brazil. I'll give you an experience that our company had in the Northeast, where we had a 200% turnover. Now, you may wonder how that happened. We acquired a plant, an operation, intending to keep on the workforce that was there. And as we introduced new methods of operation and new equipment, it became clear that this workforce was not capable of understanding how to operate in the new environment, how to use the new equipment. Safety issues arose. And so we had our first 100% turnover. We hired an entire new workforce who came to us with apparently the credentials that would allow them to adapt to the new techniques, to the new technology. A few months later, we had another 100% turnover because we learned that even though ostensibly these people had the right schooling, the right preparation for these jobs, they weren't prepared. And we had to start preparing them really at a very basic primary school level in many cases, just to make sure that they were able to understand the manuals, they were able to operate machinery in a safe way. It's not that they weren't incapable of learning, and in fact, we're very happy with the workforce fully trained in our own facilities that we have now. But saying that you had finished primary school didn't mean that you had adequate education to work at a plant level operating modern machinery. As we look to expand, particularly in the Northeast, we're coming up against that problem over and over again, and companies just have to begin with the educational basics being provided through their own operations, not counting on certainly public school education to provide qualified workers. I don't even want to talk about physical infrastructure problems because, you know, we've all talked about them for so many years. The quality of the roads, the congestion of the ports. We all talked about is the Brazil cost, the Coastal Brazil, right? What we had to pay to operate in Brazil and what companies are prepared to pay to operate in Brazil because the market is so attractive. Some of that is going to take time to correct. Some of the bureaucratic infrastructure, I think, could be corrected a lot more quickly. Some of the things that we've heard about here that force companies to spend their energy and time not on being creative, but on sort of the make work of filling out endless tax forms, of waiting for express shipments to be cleared so that operations can continue, which have halted for lack of a part that's in an envelope sitting on a customs agent's desk. There was an innovation summit. I think companies in general would like to spend their time and direct their executives for being innovative. Instead, we spend too much time trying to figure out how to do things, how to, in some cases, get around things to be able to continue to operate. One of the other areas of concern is the scope and the competence, and in some cases the approach, not to say ideology, of regulatory agencies. And this varies greatly with sectors, I know. But a regulatory agency that has meaningful openness toward the private sector that it is trying to regulate is a real boost to investors who are considering expanding, and particularly if you're considering offering new innovative products in a country. Can you get the products approved in a reasonable amount of time? Will your intellectual property be protected once you do? Can you count on regulatory authorities to understand what your new the products or your new services or methods of operation may be? And can you count on them to make science, fact-based decisions rather than reacting based on some outdated ideology, or even still the idea that if it wasn't made in Brazil, then it can't possibly be effective in Brazil. Those are all the the narrow, or some of the narrow business issues we talk about. I think Brazil has tremendous potential in that broader scope of global business. I think it can play a role in global business, in part because of the changes I've seen taking place in Brazil. Tom Shannon talked about the changes he saw between in the 15 years that he was out of Brazil. Changes even in the last few years in the Brazilian business community make it increasingly possible for Brazil to play a constructive, creative role in facilitating global business. Braskem and other Brazilian companies who are running up against their own issues as they establish operations around the world, and who are forcing business associations in Brazil to tackle these issues on behalf of multinationals operating there, so that reciprocity precedent will exist for them to tackle some of these same issues abroad. We work a lot with ABIA, the Brazilian Food Industry Association, for example, and they're a member of FIESP. FIESP, as many of you know, was at one time one of the more conservative, more protectionist business organizations, not just in Brazil, in South America. The openness of an organization like ABIA to food and beverage companies from outside is important, because Brazil Foods is exporting to other countries, of course. You have the largest meat-producing company in the world in Brazil now. Those private sector players, I think, are going to encourage the government to play a more productive role on global business. On food security issues, where does an agricultural powerhouse like Brazil fit in as we look at the billion people who are still starving in the world? Where does Brazil contribute on climate change? I think this is someplace where, if you look at, where is Brazil's relevance to the rest of the world, Brazil can be really relevant in issues of climate change and energy. These are great opportunities for businesses that are in those sectors, but they affect all of us who are part of the world. I mean, we care about the world because we're part of the world, right? It's that simple. As the new government comes in, then, on both the narrow business issues and the broader Brazil's place in the global commercial world business area, we look at the successor to Lula and ask not will they stay the course so much as can they do more? Can they undertake at home domestic reforms in the labor sector, tax reform, a more comprehensive pension reform, some of the things that Lula tried to do but wasn't able, even with his tremendous political skills, to mount the coalitions for. And on the global scene, given that no leader will have the convoking authority or the personal presence of a Lula, how will the next president keep Brazil active and a leader on some of these key global issues? From the private sector, we want to play a role in helping them do that. Thank you.
Joel.
Thank you.
You didn't interrupt me even once. I was disappointed.
My wife's really gotten on my case about that. No, it's actually, and I'm going to try to make a few of the weave some of my comments based on what you said, Ambassador. And it's a pleasure to be here again. I'm going to try to talk as little as possible about ethanol and more talk about what really Paulo asked me to focus on from a Brazilian industry's perspective in terms of economic leadership. And I think one of the things that Ambassador Shannon was pointing out, I think we all have seen this, and if you haven't, you really been sleeping, not only here but in the last few years in watching Brazil, is that there's this moment of transformation, that there's this fascinating change going on in Brazil. And I think one of the way I look at it is I remember my childhood back in the 50s. No, but the change that was happening in the U.S. back in the 50s, this sort of domestic-led growth in the United States, this booming economy, this booming manufacturing sector post-Second World War, this projection of the United States abroad and its power. And in some ways, I see a lot of that, some similarities with that in Brazil today. Pepsi, Kraft, and all these other companies are looking at Brazil not from a standpoint of export-oriented growth, not looking at, well, you've got cheap commodities, so I'd like, to get your sugar to make sodas and export it somewhere else. But really, there's all these other people who want to buy better goods. And they have income to do it. And that transformation is really fascinating. That's, I think, when Brazil is really realizing its potential, what is happening. When you look from the standpoint of sort of Brazil's leadership, historically, it's always been looked upon as sort of the government's role in projecting Brazil's position abroad, and that's obviously natural. I think Brazil has and will continue to play that role, the government. But Brazil, the business community, be that the Brazilian business community or the let's call it the foreign investor in Brazil, although I think that line is so blurred today that it's kind of almost hard to tell. I mean, you ask a Brazilian, is GM a foreign investor? And I think most people says, no, GM is a Brazilian company. But, go ask GM Detroit, that's their leading, that in China is really where they feel like they're making money these days. And for an American who, having the ability of being dual citizenship and be able to criticize both countries as I see fit, if you throw the term national interest, what's in the U.S. national interest, most Americans sort of think very easily about it then says, well, that's sort of how we project, what's important to us, our values, national security interests, national economic interests. Say that to a Brazilian and Portuguese, and immediately, I suspect, thinks back of dictatorship, strong government, the military, we gotta assert our position. And the reality is, I think in Brazil, that's like the last part of the transformation that I would say the business sector has embraced faster than the government, which is there are things out there in the world that are important for Brazil as a government, and there are things out there that are important for Brazil as business. And sometimes those aren't going to be the same. And the way I look at this in the last 8 years is from the concept of what does Brazil want, right? Which is a typical American question for investing. Where does Brazil want to be in the future? And I often refer to this as sort of what's Brazil's ambition. I think President Lula was really the first to sort of actually answer that affirmatively. I think a criticism I always have and others have of Cardoso and some of the PSDB folks is they're almost a little bit ashamed of some parts of Brazil, so they didn't want to completely go out there and says, here's what we want. Lula had no problem with that. Says, we want to be a top dog, if to use a very casual term out there. And the business community, I would say, did that even ahead. I mean, remember at the end of the Cardoso government when Petrobras changed its name for at least, I think, 24 hours to Petrobras? That wasn't, I mean, it was a disaster of a PR stunt, a PR move, but it was actually, if you think about it, it was the company realizing that it had to have an international role. And then maybe adding the Brás out there wasn't the best thing. And those two things were always constantly going on, the government having its role and the private sector having its role. When I look at what I've been doing for the last 2 or 3 years here in D.C., which is representing the Brazilian sugarcane industry, there have been most of the time the government and the industry are in sync. We all want to drop the tariff on imported ethanol. We all love to get rid of the sugar quotas so that manufacturers of food and beverages can buy their sugar a little cheaper from Brazil instead of twice the price from the domestic program. But there are times we disagree. And the disagreement is very similar to sort of how Ambassador Shannon and the minister was talking about the sort of a fine disagreement. The industry has learned to disagree with the government. A case in point has been, and I think has been well documented, has been on the Iran issue. Is there's sort of this general split, and I think the Pew research showed of sort of the government's, or how the government was projecting its posture, and what Brazilians really view and how they view the issue with Iran's alleged nuclear program. But when it came down to this ethanol industry, this becomes a real problem. Here's the issue. The UN Security Council, brief history, UN Security Council had voted through the sanctions. The United States and Europe had already planned and actually had legislation drafted for their own unilateral sanctions. And in the U.S., because the U.S. had already a lot of sanctions on the books against Iran, one of the ones they were adding was you couldn't export or be a company, any company that has a business with the U.S. couldn't be in the business of exporting gasoline to Iran. The issue being Iran has no refining capacity, so they export crude, import gasoline. You say, what does that have to do with ethanol? Well, welcome to the 21st century. The blogosphere and some of the folks who are not so crazy about Brazilian ethanol started spreading the word, hey, Brazil's going to sell ethanol to Iran as a way to circumvent the sanctions. And that issue started picking up steam. I started getting calls from the Hill, staffers in the conference committee reconciling the Iran sanctions legislation, saying, hey, Joel, people here think that you guys are exporting ethanol to Iran. Is it true? And I said, I don't think so, but give me 2 seconds. The beauty of Brazilian government, you can go up into CESEX and get the trade data immediately for the last I don't know how many years and confirm that Brazil has never sent a drop of ethanol to Iran. And then I went to the UNICA board and said, guys, has anybody here had or will have any plans to sell ethanol to Iran? And says, no way, we don't want to sell there. It's too small of a market. We want to sell in the U.S. and Europe. So I went back to the Hill and says, folks, U.S. and Europe are 2/3 of the world gasoline market. That's where we want to be. If that requires us saying forever we'll never sell ethanol to Iran to get this market, that's a fine deal. It's a business deal. I mean, if you're a beverage company, do you want to sell it in the small market and have a little preferential treatment there, or do you want to sell it in the whole market and have a level playing ground? There we disagreed with the government, so we were very clear. In fact, we briefed on both sides of the U.S. and the Brazilian side. Says, listen, we have this disagreement. We're going to tell the Hill, the committees, that it's fine. If they want to put sanctions on ethanol exports from the to Iran, that's fine. In fact, I think Congressman Engel authored a section of the Iran sanctions bill that says precisely that. They will monitor this. Why am I pointing this out? Is that now you've got business interests from Brazil looking at legislations in another country that may be going against or in conflict with stated maybe Brazilian policy, and it's a healthy disagreement. We were doing it because it's simply not, we have no view on Brazil's policy vis-a-vis Iran. It's from a commercial standpoint, so long as it doesn't affect the business, sure, do whatever they want to do if they think that that's the right thing to do. From our standpoint, we just didn't want to jeopardize the commercial efforts we had here in the U.S. And I think one of the fascinating things you have seen in the last few years is that kind of process, sometimes disagreement, often in agreement, has been very welcome to Brazil. And I would say it's probably one of the reasons Brazil has succeeded in the last few years. So in some ways, I would disagree a little bit with my friend when you were talking about Pedro Mota da Veiga saying that the diplomacy maybe has been a little too defensive. I think there's been a lot of change. I think the government has recognized, but at times the private sector is what needed a change. I think Fiespe's change has been extraordinary, especially on climate change. I mean, we didn't get a progress in Copenhagen, but Brazil went there saying, we're willing to do things that heretofore we never agreed to. You now have Brazil, the government, and in fact, the private sector may be even further ahead than the government. I think the government just right with it, saying, you know what, in this issue of climate change, we have nothing to lose. Our only issue in Brazil is to deal with deforestation, which, by the way, it's in our own national interest, notice the use of national interest here, to do that. And if we do, we win. We win from a commercial standpoint. We win from a policy standpoint. And I think that's been fascinating. And then just to close is to say what Donna was pointing out about the changes necessary in Brazil for whether it is in terms of education, infrastructure, and taxes, which I would really put also high on the list, are requirements for Brazil to be an engine of, for exports as well, for growing it, to exercise its economic leadership abroad. That's a real problem. I mean, when we talk about infrastructure, we're not only talking about infrastructure to sell goods within Brazil, but get those goods out. Today, Brazil, if you look just from the ethanol standpoint, we have a problem. We can only get so much to the port, no matter how much we produce. And on taxes, for example, I often say Brazil needs a free trade agreement of the states inside Brazil. Because sometimes, and we do it also on our website, we'll say, here are the states you shouldn't buy ethanol, and that's not how we put it, but basically, because the taxes are so high in some states, don't waste your time. We can't compete there. And when it's cheaper sometimes to deliver ethanol in the port of New York than, say, in the city of Rio, which used to be the case, or even Minas Gerais across the state's border, it sort of begs the question of, why do we need a free trade area of the Americas when we can't even get the free trade area of Brazil worked out? And I point this out not because it's a choice of one or the other, but you've got to do both. And for Brazil to realize this potential at this critical moment of transformation, it has a very high-class problem, which is it has to do a lot of investments. It has to grow. It has to continue providing, let's call it the fuel for this economy to grow. And it's only going to, it is a high-class problem, but it's also a problem that is solved by money. I mean, there's very few of the problems of Brazil that can't be solved, with the exception maybe of corruption that would probably maybe need less money there, but is that money can solve. I mean, money can build roads, money can build can improve education, and hopefully soon we will have less, as many people studying international relations, but more people studying synthetic biology, business and things like that. Because today, if you ask, I was asking a friend of mine who's he's in Wall Street, considering a move to Brazil, to one of the investment banking houses. I said, why, Brazil's cool and stuff, but you're going to make less money there. He says, no, Joel, there is a $100,000 premium on the same job in São Paulo versus Manhattan. Why? Because there's such a desire for, in this case, investment analysts. They'll say, we'll pay you more plus give you all the perks that you need. We'll move you there and pay you more. It's just astronomical. And if that's not an incentive for transformation, I don't know what is. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Yes, we have a little bit of time for questions. See there.
No, David first.
Thank you. David Atkinson, Princeton in Latin America. Hey, Donna. How are you? Nice to see you. I have a macro question and a micro question. The macro is that each of you has alluded to the transition and whether whoever wins, I think Dilma is still leading.
Dilma.
Whether she can not only carry through with the charisma that Lula had, but not only internationally but nationally. In other words, what is your take on the capacity for her to continue to lead the country, not only in the international sphere in terms of the projection, but also because I feel that Lula also was able to manage to make peace among various different parties within the country. And so that's the macro question. The micro question is this, aimed at specifically the private sector. To what extent is the protection of patents and trademarks a concern, and what are specific recommendations for say a U.S. company who wants to go into Brazil to protect their marks?
I think I can comment these 2 points. First, I'll go to the micro issue. Brazil has a pretty good standard of intellectual property protection domestically, which is different from the position Brazil adopts at multilateral forums. So your patent and your trademark will be very protected in Brazil. There is a guarantee that it will be protected. You might have some problems filling out the patent application. There will be there's a lot of problems, but the protection of the property will be assured. Okay. And this has to do with some of the points that I was presenting before. You clearly, intellectual property is a typical topic where you see a contradiction between what Brazil does domestically and the position Brazil has at international forums. Instead of promoting this as an asset that the country has, as several other countries do, and you look at India promoting investments, trying to attract investments, one of the things they will show is how much India has improved the intellectual property protection and how they have all these legal guarantees for that. And this is not something Brazil does. Okay, this would really help attracting new investments. And I'm talking about quality investments, not just investments. I'm talking about innovation investments and things like that. Okay? So I think this is the first point. The second point, I think it's a good question. Everyone has been discussing not only Dilma's leadership overseas, her charisma overseas, but also her capacity to continue the domestic reforms that Lula started, dealing with the parties, the coalition parties. Even though she's going to have a very large support, she's going to have most of Congress supporting her. This is like it's expected to be the biggest government since the democratization of Brazil. So this is from the formal perspective, she's going to have a lot of support from Congress. But there are doubts on whether or not her leadership is going to be able to bring together all these coalition parties and even the Workers' Party itself, which is not a founding member of the Workers' Party. So some people have doubts on whether or not she'll be able to enforce his leadership over the Workers' Party. Would you like to comment?
I guess I would just say I think that the Brazilian Patent and Trademarks Office is one of those changes that has been really great to see over the last decade, and it is a very serious institution. I think a key, though, is can the analysts and the technicians keep up with the tremendous innovations that are being presented in Brazil, be the techniques of processing or ingredients used in products. I mean, sometimes you're just coming in with new ideas and you'd like to launch in Brazil even first, and sometimes it involves using locally sourced items, and it's just very difficult to get them to focus on the innovation as something that can be approved and needs to be approved pretty quickly. On the issue of leadership, I'm really bullish on Brazil, as I think most people know. And I think, obviously, if it is Dilma, she's no Lula, and neither is José Serra Lula. But, I think Brazil internationally, if I answer my own question, I think is capable of carrying itself to a great extent. I don't think it depends on any one particular leader. I think the national identity is strong enough to keep Brazil as a strong international presence. Domestically, I think the jury's still out. I mean, if it is Dilma, she can clearly manage. I remember U.S. companies liked Dilma as the Secretary of Mines and Energy because she was very hands-on. She got down the nitty-gritty of their issues. A president can't afford to do that generally. Can she lead? Can she lead the others who are capable managers? For me, that's still an open question. And I agree. She's supposed to have what they're saying, maybe 200 seats in the Câmara from the coalition, and up to 2/3 of the Senate is what I've been hearing. But that doesn't mean even within the coalition, those guys are all going to stick together and vote a party line. So I think that's going to be building that coalition over and over again, which is what it takes, is going to be tough.
Okay, I think Paulo has a comment.
No, I wanted to ask Joe a question about, you mentioned something about what needs to happen in Brazil, private sectors, or so the relationship becomes a little bit better. And I would like to ask you a question about what needs to happen in the United States regarding specifically your issue, because I'm glad you sent me something that I think you should share with everybody, which is this little film or animated thing that you, which about the tariff, the corn, and I've been following this. Other than the strength of the lobby, the corn lobby, there is no economic reason, rational reason to keep the subsidies here. But I wanted you to just give up to date and tell people how they can link to the little video that.
Well, if you want to watch the video, I mean, it's on YouTube, but you go to sweeteralternative.com and you'll get all about that there. It's just a 4-minute attempt to try to describe these complex subsidies and tariffs and things. Thought it'd be easier than trying to file legal briefs. I'm a believer that I mean, in some ways, to the previous question, what Brazil needs is kind of clear, less detailed policy regulations, but sometimes just more direction. I mean, for the ethanol industry, they want to know, says, okay, so we now all of a sudden decided that everything is pre-salt and that we should give up on all the renewable energies that we've been developing in Brazil. That's the kind of thing Brazil wants to know internally. From the U.S., I mean, there's two things. One is you have to look at reality, and the reality is in the U.S. I mean, we've done polling for our own stuff. There's zero interest in doing anything that has to do with closely resembles trade opening. I mean, it is the American today is so scared that, we've done polling, there are focus groups, people will say, I'm willing to pay more if it's made right here in America. Mind you, the guy who's saying that just went to Walmart to buy everything he wanted for his house, which he thinks is made in America, until he looks at the label. It defies reason in some ways to think that America is going to be completely self-sufficient. But that's the approach they have now, and you have this huge deficit. So from our standpoint, we've been like, well, the only way to, we can't talk about the virtues of free trade and to an audience that doesn't want to hear about free trade. We're pointing out the issues of the $6 billion a year that they're wasting on ethanol subsidies when it's not necessary. But from the vantage point of a Brazilian interest in the U.S., it's great that the U.S. has a lot of other things on its agenda. I mean, it's sort of like a teenager coming to his prime and his parents decided to go on a road trip or are focused on something else. It's time to take advantage of that moment. In this case, hopefully not on a drunken binge, but in this case, to do the things we should do it. I mean, I remember a conversation actually at the American Dialogue a few years ago where there's this whole debate over well, the U.S. is just not focused in Latin America post 9/11 and so forth, and isn't this horrible? I said, no, that's not horrible. It's great. Now you don't, if Brazil, especially in the case of Brazil, you don't need the foreign aid. You need to unleash this engine of growth. If President Obama's occupied with other things, what's wrong? What Brazil needs, and the companies need, I think that's what the role that UNICA's try to play, is come in here and say, okay, here are the specific things we want to change in this area. So we had regulatory issues with the EPA. We went there and addressed it. We had regulatory issues in California. I spent a lot of time in Sacramento and resolved that for the Brazilian ethanol industry. Meanwhile, whatever they want to do at the very high level is good. The MOU, for example, biofuels is a great platform to talk about some of these things. But brass tacks is getting things done for business, and that's what it's focused. And if the U.S. wants to, spend its time in other issues, so be it.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question.
It's Laurel Vogelsang with Eli Lilly. Thank you. This was incredibly informative. I'm very interested in the comment about how, for instance, the lines are blurred between the multis and the domestic companies, and the example with GM, how, hey, that's a Brazilian company. And my question is targeted at what we're seeing is increased interest to promote the local industries, but along the lines of public-private partnerships. And I'm curious to know if Pepsi has engaged in any areas to sort of help you on that playing field, if you will, if there are any requests from government or interests overall to stimulate technology. When you talk about the jobs that are needed for skilled labor, government looking to build up its infrastructure, are there any areas in that realm you've explored?
You want to talk about your comment first?
Well, yeah, I guess I'll give you a sort of an example of where the lines are really blurred. So on the ethanol issue, we make ethanol from cane, and so in the U.S. you make it primarily from corn, so the tension has been sort of the cane guys versus the corn guys, right? The largest consumer of corn in the United States is, no Unica people in the audience are allowed to answer, JBS, a Brazilian company. 7% of American corn is consumed by the cattle, hogs, and poultry that JBS, another Goiás company I might add, my home state, it has today. Now, why is that relevant? Because the biggest user of corn in the U.S., in essence should be the darling of the corn industry, happens to be from the country that also is trying to bring down these tariffs on ethanol. It means that JBS U.S. is sometimes my allies on taking on ethanol, yet they're both kind of Brazilian interest. And then there's the Paulo in another forum was pointing out that Budweiser is now owned by a Belgian company that really has a Brazilian as a CEO. So what world are we coming to? On some of these things, the lines are blurred just because that's how Brazilian businesses evolved. On other areas, it's blurred or is like in pharmaceuticals because the government may be seeing a champion. They want to make a champion out of this industry. And there, I find that you're going to do a lot of head scratching, I think, in the next few years because, I thought Embratel was dead in the telecom business in Brazil, but apparently it's not. Right? It's being brought back to life. And I think in some of these cases, it's going to be a headache. But, I think we got enough, in Brazil, as you probably learned, you got to separate the rhetoric of the campaign, just like here, and the rhetoric of sometimes even the president, with the reality of the process. And I suspect there's, there's jeitinhos, there's ways to work through this process in a more positive way. I don't know if you.
If you say PepsiCo in Brazil, most people think of the can of cola. But in Brazil, we are Elma chips, we are Lucky, we are Quaker, we are Coqueiro fish. And there's I have to tell you, a constant discussion between brand managers and people from corporate about how much you want to identify the local brands with the corporate name. But because we have all of these other products in Brazil, we are a huge agriculture company in Brazil. We have a lot of contract farms, and one of the areas where we have partnered with the government is in agricultural research and sustainable agricultural techniques. Embrapa is a big partner of ours, not only in Brazil but in other places around the world, in reducing the amount of water in particular that's needed for agricultural production, in particular for potatoes, but also for oats in the south and southeast. So the answer with those quick rundown of some specifics is yes, Brazil is interested as government agencies in partnering with private sector, regardless of whether you are a foreign company or Brazil based.
Okay, I'll take just one last question from John. Yeah.
I'm John Maestro, U.S. Education Finance Group, and a retired U.S. diplomat. This is an education question. Are there enough engineers and scientists and industrial people at the levels that you want being prepared in Brazil for the globalized economy? And if not, do you see the need for increased cooperation with the United States at those graduate levels for their producing that level that is needed?
I think both of us have said there isn't.
No.
Absolutely not.
There's not enough engineers.
I mean, you know, from a foreign policy standpoint as well, cool, people study international relations. I look at this as, oh my gosh, you know, this is not what we need. Well, you have enough people, but the issue is how do you then deal with this in a timely way, because nobody wants to use the expression in Portuguese, morrer na praia, right? You know, my biggest dilemma is, okay, so we build this booming world biofuels market and renewable energy, and we're competitive and stuff. Okay, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the people, the know-how to do this? It's a high-class problem. I'm not sure the answer is necessarily cooperation, but somehow unleashing, you know, the true innovation. I mean, Brazilians can solve problems like the best of them. And this is a problem that needs to be realized. And up to now, we've focused on, you know, we used to spend a lot of money on very technical education for very few, and then now we've been spending money at, you know, secondary education. Now we got to tie those things together. And, you know, it's sort of like the problem in Washington. We got lots of lawyers here. Maybe we need less lawyers. You know, have you checked how many? There's, I think, one doctor on Capitol Hill. You know, there's a few people with business degrees, and that's the same thing that needs to happen in Brazil. Not have more lawyers, but have more technical expertise.
That could be the exchange.
If you compare the number of lawyers in Brazil with the number of engineers, and then you do the other way around in China, you will see interesting figures. You barely have any.
You know, I think Joel used an interesting word, you know, the sense of urgency. I mean, none of what we're discussing here is new to Brazil. I mean, Brazilians discuss these topics all the time, and they are spending a lot more time and attention on issues of education now. But you know, can you move fast enough?
Time's a wasting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We have a coffee break now. We'll try to be very brief since we're lagging behind time here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.